and the Russians losing.
You're listening to Speak Free Radio, the free speech internet radio platform.
Good evening, everyone. This is Charlie Lincoln in New Orleans, and I want to wish you a happy Pearl Harbor Day. Happy Pearl Harbor Day, what a strange phrase. Celebrate an allegedly sneak attack bombing in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. It was a day that changed history, and I think that it's, in many ways, it's one of the key dates in American history. It is the key date in American history, and I want to talk about it today. And I want to talk to you about Sam Dixon was saying last night that you can only have one eccentricity or two. And by that standard, I guess I'm way too eccentric. I do not accept a lot of the views of history that are taught in school. The Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor is one of those things in history that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense that the Japanese, who were basically winning the war against China, they were conquering China. They had already conquered Korea and a significant part of China. Why would they want to pick a fight with the United States of America? It was nonsense. It was only an excuse to get the United States into World War II against the huge weight of public opinion in the United States in 1940 and 41. Franklin D. Roosevelt only won re-election with a guarantee that he would keep America out of the war. Anybody who could have read between the lines saw that he was already preparing for war. But what I want you to focus on is the structure of events in 1941. And I hope that you'll agree with me that 12/7/41 goes together with 9/11/01 as one of these staged events that transformed America for the worse. I live here in New Orleans, and for various strange reasons, New Orleans became the site of the National World War II Museum. Now, the National World War II Museum is a huge tourist attraction. It's gigantic. It occupies like 4 square blocks in the central business, formerly known as the Warehouse District, right behind Lee Circle, catty corner from the old Confederate Memorial Hall, which is a tiny museum by comparison. a little church-like structure built in the late 19th century in memory of the War of the Southern Confederacy. But the World War II Museum is gigantic. And I attended the opening back in the 1990s with my son. Pearl Harbor Day was something that I always have marked every year for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that my father was at Pearl Harbor. He was an 18-year-old newly trained seaman. He had gotten away from family farm as soon as possible, and he wanted to go to sea and see the world, and wow, he did. He saw 4 years of the Pacific War, starting on Pearl Harbor and finishing after Pearl Harbor. No, not after Pearl Harbor, after the surrender, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was actually trained during the war as a radio man, and he was one of the first. He was probably the first radio man into Nagasaki and then Hiroshima. He had been on Okinawa. He was fought in all the major battles. He was an extraordinary man, and I miss him. He died 12, 13, 14 years ago now. My math is bad. He died in 2009. But he was born on June the 6th, 1923. So he was actually born 21 years before D-Day. Another reason that I attended the opening of the museum here in New Orleans is it was on D-Day because it was originally called not the World War II Museum, but the D-Day Museum. Anyhow, Studs Terkel was an American journalist who wrote some very popular books, and possibly his most famous book is one called The Good War. It was about World War II. And I'm here to tell you that World War II was not a good war at all. It was a disaster. It was a tragedy. And Pearl Harbor Day is worth remembering, not because of what the Japanese did, because I think the Japanese were prompted. The Japanese were instructed. They may have even had a deal with Franklin D. Roosevelt to start the war in the hopes that a Japanese sneak attack would, and then a collateral declaration of a responsive declaration of declaration of war by the United States would then lead to Germany declaring war. It worked like a charm. Pardon my saying so to all you who are NS fans out there, but Hitler did some very boneheaded, stupid things during World War II, and nothing was stupider than declaring war on the United States. If he had just held his hand that day and said, Japan, you got yourself into this, you better figure it out on your own. The Germans got no benefit out of their alliance with Japan whatsoever. Not one iota. Both Japan and Germany were oil-poor countries trying to conquer oil-rich countries. Japan actually had a better shot at it, conquering Indonesia and Indochina, than Germany did. And basically, if Japan had left the United States alone, they probably could have dominated China and even taken over parts of Southeast Asia, Indochina. I'm not sure that they could have gotten by with taking the Dutch East Indies, but they could have been a great imperial power just by ruling China. And so one is totally lost for a rational explanation of Pearl Harbor, except for U.S. provocation, U.S. invitation, a deal with Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, it's not as irrational if you think about it, because war is a form of trial by combat. This program is called Legal Realism, and the most elementary realistic statement that we can make about war about law is that law litigation is a substitute for dueling between fighting it out. Animals fight it out. Our gorilla and chimpanzee relatives in nature have brutal battles, sometimes to the death, over food or mates or dominance, usually relating to mating hierarchy. And of course, early humans undoubtedly had the same pattern, but because of our special adaptation of language, we substituted a war of words, which is what law really is. It's war by words. And war in itself remains a judicial concept, a trial by combat. Trial by combat was highly ritualized during the medieval period. Duels were allowed. A wonderful book, The Last Duel, about the last royally sponsored duel in France. Noblemen used to have to go through a very elaborate process in medieval France to get to a legal duel. I highly recommend that book. And there's a movie that's not quite so great that was made from it too. But World War II, like so many wars, was a trial by combat. And it has its own mythology, we know. The mythology is that the Japanese and the Germans were the bad guys, and that we saved the world for democracy by overthrowing them, by obliterating their pre-World War II governments. I don't really share that perspective on life at all, and I'm fairly sure that a lot of you out there don't really share it either. Even if we accept that the United States was a worthy democracy, it was already on the road to being something unworthy by the time World War II started. We were already well, waist deep in socialism, I would say. We had done more than tipped our toes in it as we did during World War I, but we'd been taking steps in the direction of socialism ever since our own Great War, which was, of course, the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. I grew up hearing it called the war between the states. You can call it anything you want, but it's easier for historical reference to call it the American Civil War. That's what most people know it as, even though in the annals of Congress and the Library of Congress, it is in all government records, official governments it's called the War of Rebellion. In any case, the American Civil War, the Great War, and World War II are, in my mind, inextricably linked. 3 stages of war to transform society, all quite coincidentally after the Communist Manifesto of February 1848. And there were socialists pushing for the war in each of those stages. I believe that the 3 great wars of in America and 2 in Europe in the 19th and 20th century were part of a very careful plan to destroy all that was good in Western civilization and clear the way for a debased form of life in socialism. I believe that very fervently. I believe that the end purpose of the American Civil War was to destroy the last vestiges of feudal society in the Americas, the strongest refuge, if you will, of feudal society anywhere in the European world. The Southern aristocracy was a nobility very much derivative from and analogous to the aristocracy of Europe. And the communists, inspired by the manifesto, led by Abraham Lincoln, did their best to destroy the traditional aristocracy of America at that point, and to change the definition of America and to change the structure of the American government. That, to my mind, is beyond reasonable doubt. That, and there's a book you should look at it called Lincoln's Marxists, and there was a huge contingent of socialist Germans who came over in the 1850s after the dislocations in Europe in 1848. I believe it's Thomas Lorenzo's book. Thomas Lorenzo has written several very excellent books about Abraham Lincoln, cousin of mine. Anyhow, the Lorenzo position is not so much that Lincoln was socialist as that he gathered around him a whole bunch of socialists and that they played a major role in the war. I go back and forth. I mean, Abraham Lincoln had a kind of passing, maybe even trivial correspondence with Karl Marx himself. Karl Marx was more of an avowed admirer of Lincoln than Lincoln was of Karl Marx. But one of the hidden gems, I think, of the American Civil War period, the administration of Abraham Lincoln, is the creation of the Department of Agriculture. Now, what does that have to do with anything? It's part of the Communist Manifesto that government should be involved in planning, the detailed and careful planning of agriculture. Marx and Engels, I should say, in the manifesto speak of the need to create industrial armies, especially in agriculture. And the creation of the Department of Agriculture under Abraham Lincoln changed the focus and purpose of American government from being a very hands-off arbiter and stimulant of economy to basically being involved in economic planning. And I think that this is a key point in understanding what happened later in the 19th century. Everything that happened in the later 19th century was, again, step two towards socialism in the United States, with the debates over the nature of money, which in the first half of the 19th century was never debated, the degree of government involvement in the creation of money through regulation of banking, which had been somewhat discussed in the Bank of the United States, but it wasn't. It wasn't. The focus was not money. The focus was on whether the United States government should operate a bank or not. And of course, that issue became resolved 50 years after the Lincoln administration, 50 years after the Gettysburg Address and the Battle of Gettysburg, the surrender of Vicksburg in 1913, with the second great leap forward for American socialism, which was the enactment of the Federal Reserve, the adoption of the 16th Amendment and the income tax, and Jerry O'Neill's favorite, the final abolition of states' rights through the 17th Amendment, taking the power to elect the Senate away from state governments and putting it in the popular vote, meaning that there is basically no difference between the Senate and the House of Representatives anymore. There was no separation of powers between the popular vote and the indirect vote through the state. And this was part of the strength of Woodrow Wilson's government that enabled him to enter the Great War of 1917 to 1918. It's only relevant for us to think about the years that the United States was involved. That 1 year involved in the Great War of Europe transformed America in so many ways. Sam Dixon and I were talking about it a little bit last night. We were talking about the fact that socialists had opposed the war, and socialists, at least nominally, and there was a great repression and reaction to overt socialism in the 1920s. But what you have to understand is that socialism always plays both sides of every game. And the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was financed by the same people who created the Federal Reserve Bank, the Warburgs and the Morgans. It was high finance that created the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and indirectly, of course, sponsored the promotion of socialism in the United States, even though socialists had taken a stand against U.S. entry into World War I. Another thing Sam Dixon said that is, to me, one of the great fascinating facts that I haven't fully explored, that he's told me, I learned from him. Felix Frankfurter, the first Jewish justice on the United States Supreme Court. Felix Frankfurter, according to Sam, was later revealed by J. Edgar Hoover to be a Bolshevik agent for Russia. Felix Frankfurter was a member of the Supreme Court for the 20 years between World War I and World War II, and his term in office was characterized by the so-called progressive agenda, transforming step by step, inch by inch, a capitalist system into a nascent socialism. Frankfurter was in the minority at the start of Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, after the famous threat to pack the court in 37, 38. Frankfurter was in the majority. World War I and the administration of Woodrow Wilson saw the great transformation of the United States into a single unitary nation dedicated to being an international power in favor of socialism. That's the great irony of World War I. It was not a war to save democracy at all. Now, once we get to the New Deal and Franklin D. Roosevelt, we're looking at much more tremendous change. Remember, you've got to think of it as 1860s destruction of the feudal class in the South, creation of the Department of Agriculture, first national income tax. Those were the great, and the introduction of greenbacks, of federal fiat currency as the national currency. All paper currency previous to that had been issued by private banks. Another story for another day. But those are the three steps that were taken towards socialism in Abraham Lincoln's administration. In Woodrow Wilson's administration, it was much bigger steps. He was basically what we often call useful idiots. Woodrow Wilson was basically one of these academics who, was everything he thought was probably great in theory, but he was a tool of those who wanted to transform America. And the election of 1912, of course, was another staged item where progressive, i.e. socialist, Theodore Roosevelt couldn't get his successor, William Howard Taft, to enact the progressive socialist programs. So Theodore Roosevelt ran against Taft, guaranteeing his defeat, guaranteeing Woodrow Wilson's victory, and somehow they took control of Woodrow Wilson completely, and he did everything to globalize and socialize the United States. It was a disaster, but not as big a disaster as the New Deal and Franklin D. Roosevelt. All through Woodrow Wilson's tenure in office, we still had gold currency. We still had, a modicum of states' rights and private property, private enterprise. All of that started to disappear under Roosevelt. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt, his first 8 years, 33 to 41, the New Deal basically took control of the American economy, but it was a very poor economy. There was no recovery from the Great Depression during the first 8 years of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration. Recovery from the Great Depression only came with war. The first glimmers of how prosperous war could be were in the Lend-Lease Act, generating ships and material for England, tremendous amounts of credit spending to assist the beleaguered British Empire, which of course had started the war by declaring war on Germany. It's amazing if you think about what the world was like in 1940, 41. America was a very clean nation. It still had the scars from the Civil War, but they had mostly healed, and everybody felt like they were Americans. And that's why you had songs like "Let's Remember Pearl Harbor." I can give you a link to Sammy Kaye singing it, or I can do a little bit of it myself. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go to meet the foe. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we did the Alamo. We will always remember how they died for liberty. Let's remember Pearl Harbor and go on to victory. Don't you feel inspired by that? Don't you feel inspired by that? Let's remember how they died for liberty and go on to victory. Well, what a victory it was. It was a victory in this sense. It was a victory for socialism. The United States population would never have consented to entry into World War II without Pearl Harbor. It was overwhelming. and it was beyond reasonable doubt that there was no American interest to be defended in World War II. There wasn't really any American interest to be defended in World War I either. It goes without saying that the Civil War was totally destroyed 1/3 of the United States, 1/3 of the American economy, and basically transformed us from a nation where some people were held in chattel slavery by other private individuals to a place where almost everyone is enslaved to the federal government today. I know that's a hard pill for some people to swallow, but it's absolutely true. And Pearl Harbor Day is one of the turning points. Roosevelt immediately got Congress to declare war on Japan within 2 days of Sunday, December 7th, 1941. We were at war. But that still didn't give Russia the ally it needed to defeat the German invasion. If, again, war is an evil thing, and if we had only just stayed quiet and not had Franklin D. Roosevelt prodding the Japanese on, there never would have been an attack on Pearl Harbor. But if Adolf Hitler had not decided to declare war on the United States, it would have been a war between the United States and Japan, which the United States would have won it pretty quick, considering how quickly we beat Japan, even while also fighting Germany. It's pretty obvious that we could have defeated Japan, taken it back. You've got to remember, back in those days, we didn't just have the Hawaiian Islands. We also had the Philippines, and the Philippines are obviously like many times bigger than the Hawaiian Islands, much more valuable as a colonial possession. And the Japanese immediately, right after Pearl Harbor, they took over the Philippines, and it was a light. As I was thinking about this talk today, I was thinking, I wonder how much time we could go in discussing alternate history. What if Japan had really wanted to conquer Hawaii? Why didn't they do it? They conquered the much larger Philippines so easily. Why not conquer? Why did they not invade Hawaii on December 7th? It's part of my, I think, airtight theory that they only attacked Hawaii because they were invited to do so in order to bring Japan and Germany into a war against the United States, a war that they could not win. There was a Japanese admiral, I forget which one, might have been Yamamoto, who said, "I fear we have wakened a sleeping dragon." Well, they couldn't have figured that out in advance, that by bombing Pearl Harbor but not taking over the Hawaiian Islands, they were merely waking up the sleeping dragon. If they had taken Hawaii along with the Philippines, we would have had no interest in the Pacific left at all to speak of. American Samoa doesn't amount to much. I just want everyone to think about the significance of the provoked or planned bombing of Pearl Harbor and how parallel it is to 9/11. the United States has a history of promoting foreign policy by false flags. In my youth at Tulane University, a couple of blocks from here in New Orleans, I used to do some acting and some singing. Probably doesn't show much anymore when I sing Pearl Harbor, but I used to be considered a pretty good singer. And one of the first plays or musicals that I was ever in at Tulane in 1976, as horrible as it sounds, the bicentennial year of the United States, which is almost 50 years ago now. It's 47 years ago this year. The bicentennial is about, I don't know what you call 250th. 150th is sesquicentennial, and I'm just not sure. I guess you'd call it a quarter millennium, wouldn't you? Quarter millennium will be in 3 years. Anyhow, it was a silly play for the bicentennial year, but the head of the music department, Frank Monachino, was searching for old and forgotten musicals that he could put on, and it turned out that John Philip Souza had written an operetta. It was called, not a musical, but it was basically a musical, an operetta called El Capitán. And it was a completely fictitious story of a false flag event in Peru that was manipulated by Spain, not the United States. Totally fictitious. But it is the first envisioning, I think, of the concept of a false flag in American in American history. John Philip Souza, obviously bandmaster to the U.S. Army, was probably in on a lot of thinking that was going on among Fabian socialists, so-called progressives in the United States. And I'm guessing that they told him that basically they were contemplating how to manipulate history through false flags. And so he wrote this operetta called El Capitán. And El Capitán is about a viceroy of Spain in Peru, the viceroy of Peru representing the Spanish crown, who is sent specifically to suppress an insurgency, a nascent revolution in Peru by the natives. They aren't named the Quechua or the Inca or anything like that, but that's who it would have been. Would have been the descendants of the Incas, Quechua-speaking people. And anyhow, the viceroy, Don Medigua was his name. Sounds like a very close pun on mentira, which means lie in Spanish. Don Medigua. Don Medigua's plan was to lead a double life as an insurgent. Basically, he wanted to sell himself as someone like, much later in time, 60 years, 70 years later, Che Guevara, a charismatic, romantic revolutionary on behalf of the Peruvian people. And what he did was he successfully installed himself as a revolutionary leader. And what he did as a revolutionary leader was he got all the natives to follow him and adore him and support him. How he managed to split his life between being viceroy of Spain and revolutionary leader, I'm not sure, but okay, it's a musical. Anyhow, he was very successful at it. And what he did was he wore out the insurgency in useless training and expenditure of energy, marching around in circles, acquiring useless equipment, basically engaging in useless activities until basically the insurgency collapsed of its own. It collapsed from exhaustion, and then once it was weak enough, of course, he alerts the Spanish troops, which show up and finish off the insurgency. And his dual role is then revealed, much to the dismay of a very hot Peruvian chick that he was having a little romance with in his role as a proto Che Guevara. We're talking about the 1890s. This was written. Che Guevara didn't show up until 60, 70 years later. In any event, that was before the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was started by a probable, it's never been proven, but a probable false flag called the Battleship Maine. Again, you have to think about incentives here. Supposedly, we went to war against Spain in 1898 because the Spanish blew up the Battleship Maine, which was peacefully visiting Havana Harbor. Now, why would Spain have blown up the Battleship Maine? Spain had a very had managed to hang on to several colonies. It had hung on to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines out of its formerly worldwide empire, including most of 2/3 of Latin America, excluding only Brazil. It would have been appallingly stupid for Spain to pick a fight with the United States and risk losing Cuba, which the United States had had its eye on for many years. One of the great proponents of annexation of Cuba was one of my heroes, the last constitutional president of the United States, Jefferson Davis. Oh, he wasn't actually president of the United States, was he? He was the last constitutional American president, though. Anyhow, Jefferson Davis, when he was Secretary of War, he had his eyes on annexation of Cuba. And I'm sure if the Confederate States of America had survived, he would have tried to realize the dream of the great circle of the southern United States taking in large parts, if not all, of the Caribbean and Central America. We should have stayed in Mexico when we had the chance in 1848. Jefferson Davis was there, Robert E. Lee was there. But again, that's another story which Sam Dixon and I touched on very briefly yesterday. There's so much to be said about history, and I want people to learn history better. They're not so confused about the present. But in any event, Pearl Harbor Day was, after the Battleship Maine, the second major. It's the first really major war because the Spanish-American War was over in a couple of months. It didn't even last a year. Theodore Roosevelt got some photo ops on San Juan Hill in Puerto Rico, but that's about the most colorful fighting we had in the Spanish-American War. I'm not saying it's a horrible thing that Spain was deprived of its last colonies. It was bad for Spain, of course, but it was the first false flag pretext war we started. There was the Lusitania in 1915 and a couple of other possible sunken ships in the Atlantic from German U-boats, allegedly. And then there was the Zimmerman telegram in Mexico. None of it made any sense, but it was all used for propaganda. And Pearl Harbor was so much bigger than the Battleship Maine or the Lusitania or the Zimmerman telegram. William Shakespeare said that all the world's a stage and the men and women merely actors in it. And I think you've got to see Roosevelt telling Japan, look, I can't get into the fight. We need to have this war as a trial by combat of who is right and who should rule the world. I can imagine such a conversation happening because, again, law originates from duels, and yet there is in the concept of both war and litigation a concept of destiny, trial by combat, winning in the eyes of God. And I think that Roosevelt might have persuaded the Japanese that a trial by combat for world domination was in their interests. Japan was still dominated by a feudal hierarchy itself at that point, which is another reason that, of course, the socialists had their eye on leveling Japanese society, as the United States occupation ultimately did, abolishing all noble titles and all feudal hierarchy except for the emperor himself, who was allowed to maintain his office, if not his his claim to divine right of kingship. It was so despicable and duplicitous what Roosevelt did, and he did it for no American benefit at all, unless you consider artificially stimulating the economy through warfare to be a benefit. And it did have that, of course, because they start the fiat spending, they start the wartime spending, and that pulls the United States out of the Great Depression. That pulls us into the post-war era. But the cost of Pearl Harbor is the destruction of Europe by the United States and Russia, and especially the United States. I mean, the United States and Britain together conducted a horrific bombing attack, but the United States airplanes simply did most of the damage to most of the cities. Simon Webb of History Debunked, if none of you listen, if there's anyone here who doesn't listen to Simon Webb podcast called History Debunked out of the United Kingdom, I highly recommend it. Simon Webb is way more focused and laconic than I am. I wish I had the talent to deliver a really intense, punched up message in 5 to 10 minutes the way he does. I just don't have it in me. I'm much too much of an academic myself. But Simon Webb recently addressed the question, why do the French still hate the British so much? And, various cultural jokes aside, he made the point, which is also worth deep thought, that the United States and Britain together killed more Frenchmen than the German invasion and occupation put together. To liberate France, we bombed more French cities, we killed more civilians, we destroyed more of France's heritage. Well, more is a bad phrase. Basically, the German occupation killed very few people. They arrested some communists, they arrested some Jews. I'm not saying that was necessarily the right thing to do, but they had arrested a small number of people and deported a small number of people. And the invasion itself, but thanks to Marshal Pétain giving up Paris, was not particularly bloody. France was able to go on living its life more or less unscathed under German occupation, but France had to be a recipient of Marshall Plan type funds in the post-war era to rebuild after the American and British liberated France. That was what Pearl Harbor brought us in France. Now, of course, in Germany, one of the diamond gems of Europe, not a diamond gem of a country, but a diamond mine, really. Thousands and thousands and thousands of priceless relics of European history and civilization, not to mention the millions of lives of Germans who were killed by the American and British invasion and occupation. That is ultimately what Pearl Harbor got us, folks. Pearl Harbor brought about the destruction of Europe. Adolf Hitler definitely bears a substantial part of the blame for that, and nobody can deny it. Declaring war on the U.S. was like signing his own death warrant. He must have known it somewhere, given what he had written about America's power and in the second half of Mein Kampf that was only recently published in the last 10 years. Hitler recognized American strength and power in part because of the huge German population we had. He saw it as the future of the German people, in fact, living in America. And his generals must have known that, so this is another one of the great mysteries of World War II, and I guess I'm running out of time today, so on Pearl Harbor Day, I'll close with that. Did the perpetrators of World War II on both sides know what they were doing? I have heard from my grandparents primarily, but they were very well educated and wise people. They said that the Fabian Socialist Plan required the progressive destruction of the old order. And in the three stages of the American Civil War, the Great War of, if you're in Europe, 1914 to 1918, U.S., 1917 to 1918, and then World War II. By the time Japan surrendered, well, by the time Admiral Donitz surrendered in May of 1945, there was almost nothing left of old Europe. Europe was going to have to be built pretty much, especially Germany, was going to have to be rebuilt from the bottom up. And Japan itself was destroyed. I want to talk to some of my friends who know Japan better than I do. I don't quite understand the alliance between Germany and Japan at all, but it's obviously highly significant. And it still persists to this day that a lot of American nationalists, American white nationalists in particular, are very fond of Japan and Japan's culture, as opposed to, obviously communist China, but also even as opposed to many of the cultures of Europe. We feel that we have more in common with the Chinese. And I guess here I should just mention, I believe that one of the interesting aspects of post-war Japanese culture is to be found in the cinematography, the animated cinematography of Hayao Miyazaki. I have been a follower of Hayao Miyazaki for many years, and I think that I highly recommend his cinematography because even though it's nominally Japanese, he's really, I think, trying to imitate Germany. I think he was a great Germanophile, and I believe that he had great fondness for German culture, and Yet Japan's declaration, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and the American declaration of war on Japan ultimately led to the destruction of Germany, which I think is one of the great tragedies of the world. And we've got to start thinking about history this way so that we can escape from the mythology that we've been given and required to listen to and believe for the past 78 years since the end of World War II, 82 years since the original Pearl Harbor Day. We are the victims of a culture of lies and deceit in government, and it is my purpose in life, and I hope yours, to explore the lies, explore the deceit, and try to envision a better world in the future. We start every episode here with Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg, and we end every episode with the overture to Die Fliegende Holländer. I have told you before, I identify myself as the Flying Dutchman. I believe that I am sailing the ocean alone, trying to bring some sort of salvation to the world, and at least some sort of peace. And that's our music, folks. I apologize for the quality of that music. Good night, everybody. Good night from New Orleans. Got to do something about this music.